Hello, I want to talk to you about building inclusive learning spaces. However, before we move in, I want to set the context of the quest for inclusion. I think it's important because some individuals are talking about inclusion but have no clue what the quest of inclusion is or where the quest for inclusion started. So, how can you build? If you are an architect or a designer or wherever you are from as it relates to building something, you have to know the layout of the land. You have to understand where things are going to be. And you have to make proactive actions in order for this to take place. But many individuals have sort of removed the historical context of the journey for inclusion and what it entails. Now, let's get this into context. Now, we must remember that inclusion did not start with the term as it relates to the 2000s and beyond, right? It started much earlier. And I wanted to share with you as a foundational thought as it relates why we need to have a quest for inclusion within online spaces and generally in learning spaces. Now, I'm sure you can remember prior to the emancipation period, the access to reading and education was limited. As a matter of fact, it was illegal for slaves to engage in education or reading. It was there. No, that was a quest for equality. Yeah, they were not seen as being equal. So they were excluded. And of course, if you look in the context, you'll notice that before emancipation, individuals were denied access or restricted from any form of education. No, that was a cause for, yes, equality. The need for equality was very present before slavery ended. And of course, after slavery ended, everyone thought it was a new time. Ex-slaves who were freed were now in a position to get what was called equality and, of course, have access. The Reconstruction brought hope, and that period lasted from 1865 after emancipation in the United States to 1877. And you see that prior to Jim Crow, we of course had hope and we were striving for equality just the same. During the Jim Crow period, we had another struggle. We had separate but equal. I can't understand that context, and I will not try to go in how you can have separate but equal. That was a sort of jargon that was pushed to suggest that equality exists. It was further from the truth. You know what happened. Schools were poorly funded that Black individuals attended. People from Europe who came over in the 1930s and so forth were given greater opportunities to have access to education within mainstream schools that were better funded in better location. And you knew what happened. How can you have separate but equal? But yet the laws were designed to suggest it was that way. And that's why I'm saying we're in a dangerous precedence when we look at laws to regulate the process of inclusion totally. Laws are there and it's important, but a bigger thing is your conscience and moral and ethics. How do you put those into laws? Yes, segregation happened. And then, of course, that period lasted from 1877 to the 1950s. A long time to be excluded from mainstream education, a long time not to experience social justice, a long time to be at the back as it relates to educational opportunities. And the quest for equality as it relates to education opportunities continued. And we go back to the 1940s and 50s, the struggle for equal rights again appeared. Because if we go back to 1865, they were still struggling for equality. And when it comes on to that, we're thinking about equality as it relates to inclusion. Inclusion is education for all, not some. Now, fast forward to the 1940s again, to the 60s, we had a new emergence. We had barriers being broken down. We had things being moved and progressed in the way we wanted to. Or should I say, we aspired to. We had a dream of, and still have a dream of becoming. Yes, that dream still exists. And of course, they would have put laws and regulations as it relates to school and access to services and so forth. And those laws would become the interpretation of human beings. Yes, for many to use their discretion as it relates to college acceptance and so forth. Yes, inclusion was now being kind of talked about in a way that was never spoken of. But yet the quest for equality continued in the 1960s. Fast forward to where we are now, to the 2020s and beyond. The quest for equality continues, and the quest for equal opportunity continues, and the quest for everything as it relates to social justice has come to a point where we have many groups now. We have individuals are being excluded because of their gender, individuals are excluded because of their culture, their religion, and now we have to be proactive in planning. And that's why I say the quest for inclusion is never ending. Today, in our present situation, we have to make connections to various elements within the inclusion process. Now more than ever, we see so many hiring of inclusion experts as it relates to inclusion and so forth. Right now, we're thinking about learning spaces as it relates to inclusion. And many people think it's more physical than anything else. So if I get everyone with a laptop and I have everyone having access to education, that's inclusion. No, that's part of inclusive education. Others will say, I practice the process of universal design for learning, but inclusion is more than that. Because if we look at using those elements, it becomes just a checklist. The reality is that inclusion is a process of including everyone, accommodating everyone as it relates to gender, religion, ideological positions, and so forth. It does not say include one at the expense of excluding the whole class. Inclusion is never ending, and you have to be consistent in what you're about. And if you're creating an inclusive online course, you have to consider that you have to address injustices in your society. For example, if you're reading a historical text that has something that is derogatory of a population in your class, you need to address it and be proactive. If you're designing content that suggests that it is dominant to one group, you need to address it. And if you're engaging in any conversation that will alienate someone, you need to address it. Because inclusion is not just a rubric, as I've seen many individuals suggesting. It has to do with conscience. It has to do with your positionality. It has to do with your own values. It has to do with your philosophy. It has to do with your mind, how you approach people, your communication, and so forth. It just does not sit on a piece of paper. Cannot overemphasize the need to understand that inclusion will not reside on a piece of paper, as I've seen individuals suggesting. The other day, someone said to me, 85% of our students have a sense of belonging. And whoa, I said to myself, what about the 15%? If that population is dominant by one population, for example, what about the 15%? Inclusion is not statistics. It's about having a sense of belonging and asking individuals who are the 15%, how can I make you included? And there's where you start, not with the 85%. The 85% are all right. I remember doing a course back in Jamaica, and the professor said to me, if you arrive at an accident scene and you see people making a lot of noise, you know what? Try to find the ones that are not screaming out or just lying down, because they need more attention. So the 15%, I think, need more attention. I know you'd agree with me. I want to go a bit deeper because I've mentioned some things that you are aware of. You're aware of, you know what, your biases, your prejudices, your ideological positions, and how these can affect a course design or your teaching and learning. And I want to go a bit further because I think that as you think about these and individuals will present you with a rubric, you have to understand that a rubric will not change your behavior. And I think that's where many, many individuals, as it relates to advocates for inclusion, advocates for social justice, advocates for online teaching and learning and various modalities, fail to understand without critical reflection upon your actions, your daily actions as it relates to interacting with your teaching population, not reflecting on those elements will not bring about change. You have to reflect and say, all right, you know what? That is what I want to do. I want to make that change, and I want to go and do that to ensure that I include students. So without critical reflection, that's impossible. And too often, individuals are presented with a rubric that requires them to be inclusive. My big question is, if a rubric could have solved the problem, wouldn't we have used a rubric a long time before? Wouldn't our population be more inclusive, accommodating, and so forth? The rubric is not the answer. A change in behavior is what is going to be required. So when we're talking about building inclusive learning spaces, we have to think about critical reflection. We have to think about how our own positions will affect those who are involved. And we have to make a change as it relates, for example, thinking about how we serve those communities that sometimes produce individuals that are not reaching their full potential. If you are aware of the Bronfenbrenner's approach as it relates to supporting individuals, you'd understand that there is a system of support. And if students in their early stages do not get that support throughout time, then their chances of being productive and academically forward thinking might not be there. My issue is we have to think about those who have not had the experience as the traditional students. We have to understand in order for them to be built up, we need to support them in that way. And we should move away from the deficit model where we assume and make assumptions about students based on their background. What are you doing at your institution? What are you doing as an individual? As a person who wants to make a better society, what are you doing from your end to design learning spaces so it can become more inclusive, more diverse, and more accommodating for all learners? I'd love to have gone deeper in some theoretical principles, but I want to leave you with one here: inclusive pedagogy. Because inclusive pedagogy is about inclusion for all students. It's about self-reflection. It's about using various methods for assessment. It's about diversifying the way you engage and interact with students. It's about respecting and acknowledging differences. And it's also about advocating for the students who are in need of accommodation. It's also about the issue of advocating for social justice within your class context. There are many other theories that you could look at. Some are connected really to critical theory. And critical theory makes a connection to post-emancipation period and also the civil rights period. And what I like about critical theory is that it makes connections to decolonizing the curriculum. There's also anti-racist education, which gives an idea of how we can address certain elements within course design. And I like critical pedagogy because it really talks about issues of social justice. Last but not least, I think the feminist perspective is an ideal way of bringing into mind the need for power balance within the classroom and curriculum, and of course, in any learning environment that has been designed. Many have moved away from this one, but I have to say it because I think it's important, because it's a theory that explains many things. And of course, it is critical race theory. I have many videos on my YouTube channel and I encourage you to visit it. These are just my thoughts as it relates to building inclusive learning spaces. These are some considerations that must be thought of, but they are not exclusive to this area. I encourage you to watch my videos, and also if you want to drop me a question on inclusion as it relates to course design and so forth, I will respond. But for now, I'm off. Thanks for watching.